This video is all about creating a cool and atmospheric landscape from scratch. Stay tuned till the end to check out the final result and a bunch of tips on how you can improve your own art. My name is Victor, I work as a concept artist for filming games, so let's start with the process. Now, this image took roughly 2 hours to complete, maybe a bit less. The goal was to create a little bit of a darker scene, overall, moodier, like gloomier lighting and all of that stuff. How do you actually start the painting process? Well, first of all, you work with your reference images. If you have in mind specific lighting scenario or maybe an environment or situation, then figure out the references you need for that. Pick a few main references so you don't have a bunch of them and you're always confused. Pick a few main references, have a couple of supporting reference images, and then start with the sketch. Okay, so when you're ready to put things down on paper, you can start by creating a very simple line work sketch. This is my go-to process usually. Or you can start by blocking in silhouettes of your objects, of your elements, or whatever you want to paint. You can do it in black and white, create like these large silhouettes, all these shapes, like big, medium, small, and kind of play around with them until you figure out your composition, especially if you have reference images to help. Architecture, for example, if it's a building or something, or it's a forest, or literally anything, that's also a viable option. So personally, I work within these two. If it's a quick sketch, I'm talking about 2-3 hours image. I don't bother going in a 3D program and creating a 3D layout. Starting with a very simple line work sketch, I figure out roughly where I want things to be. Fill in all your main elements with just flat colors. So you don't worry about light for now. Block in everything with flat color. You take your flat color from the reference images, returning to how important it is to work with reference. Figure out what kind of values roughly you want to give your object. So the initial flat value that you gave to your elements is now going to be addressed. You'll adjust it, you'll make sure that it works, everything is readable, there is a clean separation between foreground, middle ground and background and all that stuff. In case of this image, a really important aspect is the design of the shapes that are created by the grassland. Notice that I'm picking a very large brush. When I'm working with the foreground, the further away I get into the perspective, the smaller the brush strokes are. Try to arrange these shapes because they're really important for your composition. Try to arrange them in an interesting way, so not completely separate from each other. They should have a rhythm to them as they disappear into distance. And once you're okay with the shape design that you created, you can continue by describing the form a little bit. So now we're introducing the light from the sky, not the direct light. For now, we're just imagining that this is a overcast scenery. So we're introducing the light from the sky. We're adding shadows to the areas which are occluded from light. And I do the same thing for the mountains in the background, picking a pretty large brush, a little bit textured, glazing on top. I'm trying to figure out the planes that are turned away from the light. So regarding the building, a little bit of texture work here and there. I'm just planning ahead where I want to have some marks, or maybe what kind of lighting I'm planning for our focal point. I'm figuring that maybe we should have the lower side of the building be hit by the light and the top part still be in shadow. I'm not too sure about it, so that's why for now I'm just putting a few brush strokes here and there just to plan things around, trying to push the values. Notice that I'm not pushing the contrast for now, so we're staying in a very low contrast process at the moment, but eventually we will have to decide which area will have increased contrast, color contrast, maybe edge contrast, maybe value, texture, all of that. A good idea right now would be to keep separate elements of your objects onto separate layers. It's really helpful to work with them later on, especially if you want to adjust, for example, the roof, and you know that I want to change the hue of the roof and it's going to be on a separate layer, and you'll do that easily. So when you're combining, I usually combine things together at the end of the process, like maybe when I reach 75% and I'm sure that, you know, this thing looks good for now, let me combine all the layers. It'll also make the file easier to work with. It'll be easier to work with the smudge brushes and the mixer brushes when I want to refine the edges and maybe like make the image a bit more interesting. I'm spending a little bit of time on our focal point, but I'm not stuck forever. So a little bit of work here, and then I'm moving on to other areas. Yeah, because we want to keep the image consistent. We don't want to have it unbalanced. Couple of brush strokes for the roof, just to figure out maybe we want to add some textural information there. So we still have one empty area, which is the ground on the bottom. It's pretty bland right now. I'm trying to create a little bit of a texture going on over there, and at the same time a little bit of a gradient. So the foreground will be darker, and as we're getting closer to our focal area, it's going to have a little bit of value shift towards the light. I'm also not done designing the ground, so you also have to you should probably think about, adding more interest where you can. And maybe a third type of material would benefit the whole scenery, and I'm trying to add maybe a different type of sand. So we have gravel on the ground, and then close to the areas with the grass we have some light colored sand, and that will improve overall the readability and add additional contrast in areas of interest. I'm also going to play around with the values throughout the whole image, because I'm trying to push them and make the whole image as readable as possible. So you'll see me sometimes grabbing the curve editor and adjusting, for example, the darks. And in some case I will adjust the lights just to make sure that they are working together. You can also try adding a few color accents here and there. If you see that, for example, an area of the image is a little bit bland, or maybe it's not interesting enough, I've added some color variation with the greens, right? We're gonna have this plain, a little bit desaturated green, and then we're gonna have little color accents of yellow here and there, which is actually, it's not even yellow, it's also green, and warmer and lighter. Now, since we have this cold light coming from the sky, I'm thinking that the shadows should be slightly bluer and lighter, and I'm gonna try to tackle all the shadows in the image like that. Sometimes it works from the first go, sometimes you have to adjust them a little bit. Don't worry about it if the contrast it's not appealing to you at first. Keep working on it, check out the reference images. We also want to add additional details to the features of this building, the windows, and also we'll use like a very simple process to duplicate details for the roof, and when you have enough of these details, according to the perspective, you can place them on top of your roof. Very simple approach. You can use it all the time when you have like various patterns and you want to place them in perspective. Create them in a simple 2D plane and then transfer it according to your perspective. So in this case I placed it on the roof, and also you don't want to make it look very mechanical. Make sure that you're deleting some of those marks, changing some of those marks, maybe transforming them a little bit, painting on top of them different color marks below it to add some variation, to add some interest. So as long as it doesn't look very mechanic and boring. Also bear in mind that the initial sketch or the rough blockout with shapes and silhouettes, that stuff is not going to be seen by the viewer, because in the end everything will be overpainted with values, colors, edge variation and all that stuff. So you don't have to be really nervous about having perfect sketch in the initial step. Don't get demotivated if your lines are not perfect or if the perspective is slightly wobbly. You can adjust that later on. I sometimes try to eyeball the perspective as much as I can. If I see that it's still wobbly, then maybe I can put down a very simple grid for a 2 or 3 point perspective and adjust the errors. Now I'm thinking that I want to have the foreground a little bit darker. So there is this gradient from dark to light towards our focal point, and I collapsed all the layers and I've created basically 2 layers, one with the grassy patches and the other one with the ground separately. I could have collapsed them all, but really it's not important. I just figured let me have control over 2 elements instead of 1. The way you can do it is just duplicate them, create a mask, use a curve editor or any tool you like to darken them, and then remove the mask where you don't want this darkness to be. So in our case, I've used the mask to remove the darkness the closer it gets to our focal point. This stage is refining, thinking about edges. You want to add some edge variations in your scene. Try to combine various approaches. Sometimes you want to create a lost edge when the values are really close to each other and you don't understand where's the actual edge, or sometimes you just want to create soft edges here and there. So take the smudge brush or just take a softer brush and glaze where you want to have this smoother transition between planes. I'm also working on adding some color variation here and there. The contrast right now is pretty much where I want it to be, but definitely it's missing something, and that something is probably a few layers of fog, a few silhouettes in the background to add a little bit of storytelling. So thinking I will add some fog in the background in front of the mountains and maybe in front of some of those buildings on the sides, and as well a little bit of layers of fog in front of our house as well, just to integrate everything into one scene. You will notice that once you add fog and atmospheric perspective, things like that, all the objects kind of are integrated in the scene, so everything becomes a little bit more believable. You don't have to go overboard with it, just a little bit here and there. And I also wanted to push the mood of the image, so that's why I'm adding this cold greenish bluish fog layer here and there. Now let's have a quick look at the final image. Notice I work a little bit on the edges. I made sure that they're a bit more interesting. There is some edge variation, and also the image became a little bit more textured because I added a sharpen filter to make sure that there is enough clarity. I've worked on making sure that there's some more color variation within it. So notice in the foreground there's a few touches of blue, colder brush strokes here and there. There's just some very simple silhouettes of some people in the background to make sure that there's a little bit more storytelling and atmosphere to the whole thing. If you found this process useful, don't forget to check out other videos on the channel, like for example this one is a completely different environment and I think you will really like it. Thank you so much for watching till the end, and I hope to see you in the next one coming soon.